She set the case on the table before she sat down, and the sound it made, that small, flat click, was quieter than it should have been. The convocation chamber held 4,000 delegates. Resolution 44 Primus had been filed 11 times in the past 9 years, each filing answered with the same procedural silence. The human delegation sat 1.1 meters below the main floor, a species-appropriate accommodation differential, per the compact's own housing language, and she had carried the empty half of that case for 9 years across antechamber floors that had scuffed the corners down to bare metal. By morning, 34 relay nodes would go dark. I am Vel Thun. I am a remnant historian of the Elori, and I was seated in the observer gallery when she set that case down. I record this account because the official session log records what was spoken that morning. It does not record what was placed on a table before anyone sat down. Kelling did not look at Seth Vral when she set the case down. None of them did. The human delegation numbered 7. They rose without a signal. There was no eye contact between them before they stood, no gesture, no nod across the table. They simply rose, all 7, at the same moment, as if they had agreed to this so long ago that the agreement itself had become a kind of breathing. Seth Vral, High Arbiter of the Voral Compact, read Resolution 44 Primus aloud. He spoke in 2 registers at once, which is a Voral physiological capability and not a performance. The authority register delivered the terms, clean and procedural, while the contempt register ran beneath it like a second channel, shading each clause with the specific tone that means. This is already decided, and you know it. Both registers broadcast to the chamber. Neither was answered. Kellen closed the case. She lifted it by the handle. She walked. I noted the sequence because nothing in it was signaled. That was the part I kept returning to in the months and years after, not the outcome, which the session log records correctly, but the silence before it. The delegation of 7 moved like something that had already happened, and was only now becoming visible to the rest of the room. No eye contact, no gesture between them, no signal of any kind. I wrote that line in my field notes that morning. I did not know then what I was writing it about. Stay close. There is something I want to show you before I explain it, and I think it will matter more if you see it first. The case was newer then. The corners weren't scuffed yet. This was year 3 of Kelling's posting, and she was carrying it down a corridor in the compact's secondary administrative wing, where the offices assigned to non-seated delegations are grouped by access tier. The human delegation had Tier 4 access, which meant they could attend open sessions, file formal objections, and use the transit lifts between floors 2 and 7. They could not attend closed committee sessions. They could not file binding resolutions without a co-signatory from a seated species, which was a condition that had not been met in the delegation's 12-year history. The case had 2 sides. The right side was empty. It had always been empty. A junior compact liaison, whose name does not appear in any record I have been able to locate, asked her about it once, why carry a case with half of it unused. Kelling said, documents I expect to file later. The liaison filed this as a routine exchange. I read it much later and thought, he was not wrong to file it that way. He was just reading the wrong layer. Operation Resting Stone began in a room that smelled of recycled air and someone's old lunch. There were 6 people in that room. The date was 11 years before the morning I watched Kelling set the case on the convocation table. On a whiteboard at the front of the room, one question had been written and not yet answered. What does leverage look like when you have no leverage? The water stain on the ceiling tile had been outlined in marker at some point. Someone had traced its edges carefully, the way you do when you are sitting in a long meeting and your hands need something to do. There was no record of who did this or when. The outline was still there 11 years later when the room was decommissioned. Director Coral sat at the head of the table. He had been in the position for 26 years at that point, which is long enough that the position and the person stop being separable. He did not pace. I know this because every account of him from that period mentions the same thing, that he never paced, that he sat very still when he was thinking, that he kept a clean desk. He wrote everything by hand. In a department where every document was logged, time-stamped, and archived automatically, he wrote by hand. No one ever asked him why, which tells you something about the kind of authority that does not need to explain itself. He said, "We are going to build something that cannot be confiscated." He did not say what it was, not that day. Dr. Nasek came to the project from xenolinguistic analysis. He was the person who worked out over a period of about 4 years that the compact's suppression architecture was not random, that the silence in response to the coalition's formal protests followed a pattern, and the pattern was institutional. And institutional patterns have edges that, if you find them, tell you exactly how the institution is held together. He kept a receipt on his desk. A cafe receipt, the kind printed on thin, slightly waxy thermal paper. He had handled it so many times that the ink had almost gone. He kept it framed, facing the wall. I noted this detail in my records of his workspace because it was anomalous. Things that matter to people are usually faced outward. Things that face the wall are either private or finished. I marked it as a character note and moved on. I was wrong to move on. The receipt was from the cafe where he had, over 2 long afternoons and 1 breakfast, worked out the basic architecture of what would later become the blackout. He had done it on the back of receipts and napkins because he did not yet have clearance to work on paper that would be logged. When he finally had clearance, he transferred everything to formal records and kept the original cafe receipt as the only thing that existed before the project had a name. He kept it facing the wall because he did not need to see it anymore. He had the whole thing in his head. He just didn't want to throw it away. Commander Austin was stationed at the Castle Null corridor before the project began, and the project found him there rather than the other way around. He had been running passive pulse only for 9 years at that point, a maintenance protocol officially, for a fleet of 51 vessels that the Compact's infrastructure records listed as mothballed pending resource allocation review. The passive pulse was a single tone, transmitted quarterly. It meant, in the maintenance encoding, hold position. In the longer language that Asen and his crew had been speaking for 9 years, it also meant something else. We remember you are there. The tone does not sound like much. Asen never described what it sounded like. He described only what it was for. LT Harvin kept a registration list. Handwritten on paper, 51 numbers, each corresponding to a vessel in the Castle Null formation. She had never crossed a number off. 11 years, and the list had never been revised, not because the fleet hadn't changed, but because nothing had left. Nothing had been decommissioned. Nothing had been reassigned. I read this later and understood what I was reading. At the time I first encountered the document, a routine fleet status attachment, filed as supporting material for a maintenance contract renewal, I noted it as unusual and did not follow up. I have since made peace with this. The maintenance contracts were Coral's idea, and they were the part of the plan that I found, even in retrospect, the most difficult to hold in my head. Humanity applied for every infrastructure and maintenance contract the Compact opened to non-seeded species. Every single one, for 11 years. They applied for contracts to service transit relay nodes, waste reclamation systems, navigation anchor points, communications infrastructure, and atmospheric processing equipment on 14 occupied stations. They applied for the contracts no one else wanted, the ones that required staff to live on-site for long rotations, the ones with irregular schedules, the ones that paid in maintenance credit rather than currency. They took all of them. In 11 years, they held active service agreements on 34 of the Compact's primary relay nodes. Not because it paid well, because it put their people inside the infrastructure. The Compact's own records list this period as a phase of expanded non-seeded integration in essential services maintenance. The language was chosen by a Compact administrative subcommittee, logged as routine, and not reviewed again for 11 years. The classification was technically correct. It just did not describe what was happening. I know this because I filed a research query against the maintenance contract archive 3 months after the morning in the chamber, and the records were all there. Every application, every renewal, every annual sign-off. None of it hidden. All of it logged, in plain sight for 11 years in a filing system that no one had thought to look at, because maintenance contracts are not where you look for leverage. The Compact filed the data under Tier 6 administrative support. The data drop I reviewed later, D3 in the record sequence, covered 847 contracts across 11 years, an average of 2.3 active contracts per human technician, all renewed without incident. Coral had built the plan. Nasek had written the architecture. Harvin had held the line. At the Castle Null corridor, 51 vessels had been sitting dark and cold for 9 years. Not abandoned, not decommissioned, sitting. They ran passive thermal cycling to keep the hulls from warping, a maintenance procedure. Technically, the kind of thing that shows up as a line item in a fleet preservation budget. The Compact's infrastructure records noted the formation as mothballed pending resource allocation review. When Vel Thun, that is, when I first encountered those records, I filed the hull preservation annotation under routine fleet management. This took me about 4 minutes. I did not look at it again for 9 years. The formation carried, in aggregate, enough navigational disruption capacity to take 34 relay nodes dark, simultaneously, to within 0.003 seconds. I did not know that when I filed the annotation. The record did not say that. The record said, hull integrity nominal, passive thermal cycling active, no crew activity, status holding. Status holding. The intelligence, when it came, was not recruited. This is the part that took me the longest to understand, even after I had access to the full record. The source was not identified, approached, cultivated, or turned. Okara, Commander Ren Okara, lead diplomatic attaché for the coalition's non-ceded bloc, did not find the source. He found a corridor. He was in a market corridor on Duvarel's lower station ring, not on any official business, buying a kind of preserved root that his family sent for occasionally and that he had developed a personal preference for. The source was at an adjacent stall. They spoke about the root, whether the harvest had been good this year, whether the price was fair. The source mentioned, in passing, that the documentation classification system for compact internal proceedings had changed 3 times in the past decade, each time in ways that made certain files harder to locate without knowing what to look for. Okara said, "That is interesting." The source said, "I thought you might find it so." They did not exchange anything else that day. 6 years later, by carrier wave exchange, the source had transmitted 2,309 pages of documentation, suppressed atrocity records, closed session transcripts, internal memos from the Compact's Legal Standing Committee, and a full index of species-specific accommodation differentials applied over a 40-year period, including the 1.1-meter platform reduction that put the human delegation below the chamber floor. Okara showed up, he sat down, he listened. He never asked the source for anything. The source told him what existed, and when the time was right, told him where it was. This is data drop D2 in the record sequence. I did not receive my copy until 41 Duvarel time, the morning of the convocation session. By then, 2,309 pages had already been read, indexed, and prepared for distribution. Year 3 of Kellen's posting. She was carrying the case down the Tier 4 corridor. The junior liaison asked about the empty right side. She said, "Documents I expect to file later." What she meant, what I believe she meant, reading the exchange against everything else I now know, was not a promise. It was a description of a system already in motion. She was not speaking about documents that did not yet exist. She was speaking about documents she could not yet carry, because the right side of the case was reserved for a record that was still being built, page by page. In a 6-year carrier wave exchange, she would not have access to for another 3 years. The case had 2 sides. The left side held the delegation's formal filing history, 9 years of Resolution 44 Primus, 9 sets of procedural silence, 9 years of showing up to the table and being answered with nothing. The right side held what comes next. She carried it empty for 9 years. The corners scuffed down on antechamber stone floors. She set it on the table the morning the record was finally complete, and the sound it made, that small, flat click, was quieter than it should have been. I noted that detail. I did not know then what I was noting it about. Now in year 14 of my account, I find that I keep returning to the corridor. The junior liaison, the routine exchange, the documents she expected to file later. I was in the gallery. I watched her set the case down. I did not know even then the full weight of what the right side carried. The part that still makes me pause, even now, she already knew how it ended. "Stay close." 13:35 Claude responded. The transmission hit Okara's terminal at 41. The transmission hit Okara's terminal at 41. He did not call anyone. He did not send a confirmation. He read the single line on his screen, 2 words, from a frequency registered to a supply routing office on Duvarel's upper station ring. And then he closed the screen, stood up, and put on his jacket. He picked up a handwritten list. 9 names. He walked to the relay room. I know this because the duty log recorded his entry time. I know the list was handwritten because he told me 14 months later that he had never kept it any other way. I asked him why. He said, "Some things you don't want filed." The relay room was small. It smelled of warm circuitry and the particular staleness of recycled air that has been recycled too many times. He sat down in front of the main panel, put the list on the desk beside him, and began to key in the first address. 14 years. That is how long Okara had been building what the Compact would later call, in its formal review, an unauthorized, non-ceded diplomatic network of significant reach. The review used that language because the Compact does not have better language for what Okara actually built, which was not a network. It was a series of relationships. Individual ones. 9 species, 9 points of contact, none of them formal, none of them recorded in any official register. A market corridor on Duvarel's lower ring. A maintenance walkway on Orva Thresh. where two junior engineers from different species spent 6 months on the same repair rotation and discovered they both kept handwritten notes. A shared transit hold on a mid-route supply vessel, where a delay of 31 hours gave Okara and an elder of the Ilori Trading Consortium enough time to have a long conversation about record-keeping and institutional memory. He showed up, he sat down, he listened. He never asked for anything that would require them to trust him more than they were ready to. He never recorded the conversations. He never told them about each other. What he built over 14 years in market corridors and maintenance walkways and transit holds was a set of 9 people who knew that when Ren Okara came to them with something, it was worth looking at. At 41, he keyed in the first address on the list. The data packet was 2,309 pages. Transmission time, 11 minutes. At 52, on a station called Orva Thresh, a terminal in my study began to receive. I did not know at first what I was receiving. The sender was listed as a supply routing relay, a standard anonymizing address, the kind used for internal administrative transfers. The packet size was unusual. I noted the timestamp because I have a habit of noting timestamps, and I noted the file volume because 2,309 pages is not a standard administrative transfer. Then I opened the first document. It was a closed session transcript from 41 years ago. The heading read, Compact Internal Proceedings, not for external distribution. The first paragraph described a formal vote to suppress documentation of a military action against a non-ceded species whose formal petition for ceded status had been filed and rejected 3 weeks prior. I read the first paragraph, then I read the second. I did not stop reading for 4 hours. The third atrocity in the sequence, pages 188 through 204, had been suppressed in the same year my own species filed a formal protest with the compact. I remembered that protest. I had been a junior researcher when it was filed. I remembered the silence that followed it. I had believed for 40 years that the silence was bureaucratic, that the protest had been mislaid, or misclassified, or simply lost in the volume of filings a body of the compact's size receives in any given year. The silence was not bureaucratic. The silence was a decision, made in a closed session, by a subcommittee whose existence had not been disclosed to non-ceded parties. In the same month the protest was filed. I tapped my wrist. I do not know when I developed this habit. I noticed it for the first time, reading page 196, and recognized that it was not the first time I had done it that night. Elder Orevan of the Ilori Trading Consortium received her copy at 54. She read the executive summary in 14 minutes. I know this because her response transmission was logged at 1:08, and the summary is 12 pages. She sent one line, "We have been holding the record open. Now we know what fills it." I read that line at 1:09 and stopped. I had been in correspondence with Elder Orevan for 11 years at that point, and in 11 years she had never used that construction, holding the record open, in any communication I had seen. It is not standard Ilori diplomatic register. It is not standard anything. It is a phrase you use when you have been waiting for something for a long time and you built a place to put it before it arrived. How long had she been building that place? I did not know. I keyed in my own response, one word, received, and turned back to page 197. At 1:18, the first relay confirmation came in. Then the second, then in the next 4 minutes 12 more. Dr. Nasek was in the operations room at the secondary coalition facility. He made tea. The kettle was the kind with a long, slow whistle rather than a sharp one, and someone on Orva Thresh described the sound to me later. They said it was the only warm sound in the room for a long time. Nasek did not sit down. He stood beside the panel and watched the counter. LT Harvin sat at the logging station. She had a pen in her hand. She logged each relay confirmation by hand as it came in, not because the system wasn't logging automatically, but because this was how she had kept every record in the 9 years since Asen had first told her about the fleet at Castle. The counter read 14, then 30, then in the next 11 minutes it read 200. The relay terminal began to print confirmations. The sound was steady at first, then faster. Then it was faster than the machine was designed for, and the confirmations began to stack in the output tray, and the sound of them coming out, that mechanical, ordinary, slightly frantic printing, was the only sound in the room for a long time. Then there was no more room in the output tray, and the confirmations began to fall to the floor. No one picked them up. At 2:13, Compact Communications Monitoring flagged an anomalous relay pattern across 14 nodes. At 2:18, the flag was escalated to a senior monitoring officer. At 2:31, 3 senior compact advisors sent clarification requests to the relay addresses originating the traffic. None were answered. The answer, if you want to call it that, was in 14 years of market corridors and shared transit holds and maintenance walkways where Ren Okara had shown up without an agenda and listened without recording. The answer was in 9 relationships that had no official status, generated no registrable documentation, and could not be confiscated because they were not located anywhere except in the specific quality of what it means to show up and listen for long enough that trust stops being a choice and becomes a condition. The compact's clarification requests had no mechanism for reaching any of that. I tapped my wrist a second time. At 2:41 LT, Harvin sent a transmission to Commander Asen at Castle Null. She used the passive pulse encoding, the same encoding Asen had been transmitting for 9 years, the single tone that meant, in the maintenance protocol, hold position. In the longer language they had been speaking across 9 years of quarterly silence, it meant something closer to, "We remember you are there." She sent the tone. Then she added 1 character to the end of the sequence. 1 character. It had never appeared in 9 years of confirmations. There was no protocol for it. There was no record of it being discussed, assigned, or agreed upon. I found the transmission log 4 months later when I was working through the full record. I read the character at the end of the sequence and stopped. I do not know what it meant. I have my own idea about what it meant. I believe Asen knew. I tapped my wrist a 3rd time, and then I put down my terminal because it was 300, and the cascade had reached 212 relays, and there was nothing left to do but wait. Kelaine, aboard the transit vessel Orvith 7, did not monitor the cascade. I know this because the ship's duty log records her location throughout the transit window, and she was in the forward room, not the communications bay. She was there from 40 through 3:17. The duty log records the duration. It does not record what she was doing. I asked later and was told she was reading. I could not explain this, and I still can't. She had spent 11 years building this. She had carried the case. She had answered documents I expect to file later with a straight face in year 3 of her posting, and then she had waited 8 more years for the record to be complete. And on the morning it was all in motion, she was in the forward room reading. I tapped my wrist. I noticed I had done it, and I stopped. At 300, I put down my terminal and walked to the observation window in my study. The sky above Orvith Thresh has a particular color at that hour, not dark exactly, but the specific deep gray of a sky that hasn't decided yet what it's going to do. I stood there for a few minutes. I was not monitoring anything. I was not waiting for anything in particular. Then my terminal chimed. Then it chimed again. I walked back to the desk. 34 nodes went dark. Not in sequence. Not in a wave moving from one point to the next, the way a power failure spreads or a signal degrades. Simultaneously, all 34 at the same time to within 0.003 seconds. No communications, no trade uplinks, no navigation. Each system 1 word shorter than the last, and all of them gone before any monitoring station had time to log the first alert. This is what 11 years of maintenance contracts buys. Not access, not influence, not a seat at the table. It buys the specific knowledge of exactly how a system is held together at the level of the people who keep it running, and it buys the quiet right to be inside that system when the moment comes. 34 nodes, 0.003 seconds. The math was the weapon. It had been built over 11 years in service agreements no one had thought to look at, in a filing system classified under Tier 6 administrative support, by technicians who had held active maintenance credentials on every one of those 34 nodes for an average of 4 years each. When the nodes went dark, the people who went dark with them were not infiltrators. They were the maintenance staff. They had been the maintenance staff. They had been doing the work correctly and carefully and without incident for 11 years, and when the time came, they did one additional thing, which was authorized under no protocol and had been planned in a room with a water stain on the ceiling tile 11 years before. Seth Vroll, High Arbiter of the Voral Compact, woke to the absence of carrier hum. He had heard that hum for 71 years. It is a feature of Voral architecture, a low carrier signal that runs through the communications infrastructure of every major compact installation, a background tone so constant that it stops being heard and becomes, instead, simply part of what the air feels like. It was gone before he was fully awake. He registered the absence as something physical, a change in the quality of the room, before he registered it as information. He lay still for a moment. Then he got up and walked to the observation port. The orbital transit lanes above Duvarel were full of ships. The ships were not moving. They were not moving because the navigation anchor network, which runs through the same relay infrastructure as the communications uplinks and the trade signal arrays, was dark, and without the network the ships had no way to know where they were relative to anything else. They knew their own velocity. They knew their own position relative to each other. They did not know where Duvarel was in the grid sense, in the way that a ship needs to know before it is safe to move. The transit lanes were full of ships standing very still, with nowhere to go. Director Coral's transmission came at 3:04. It reached every compact station simultaneously, on the emergency frequency, which the maintenance contracts had also covered. His voice was even, not cold, not triumphant, not the voice of someone delivering a defeat or enjoying a moment they had waited for. It was the voice of someone saying something aloud that they have said in their head many thousands of times, something that has been rehearsed not as a performance, but simply because the moment required understanding exactly what needed to be said, and the understanding had come a long time before the moment did. He said, "This is not a war. This is what happens when 11 notices are not answered." That was the complete transmission. Vel Thun, I recorded, in my field notes that morning, that Sethvral stood at the observation port for a long time. I received this detail from a source inside the installation, whose account I have no reason to question. My source said he stood there and looked at the orbital lanes and did not move. I do not record what he said when he finally turned away. I have the account of what he said, but it does not belong in this record. What he said was private, and it was said to no one, only to the room, and I think that matters. I record only, I believe he counted something, I could not see what. 91 hours of silence followed. The compact held 14 emergency sessions. 6 draft transmissions were composed and not sent. The emergency frequency stayed open throughout. Humanity transmitted nothing. At hour 47, 3 members of the non-Voral block sent transmissions to Orvith Thresh. They used the conciliatory register, a formal communication mode that I had not, in 11 years as a compact observer, seen any block member use in correspondence with a non-seated party. It is the register used between equals when one of them needs to say something that costs them something. I noted the register shift in my field log with one line. I did not add commentary. The shift said everything that needed to be said. Sethvral did not concede in those first 91 hours. He was not presented with a demand to concede. Humanity sent nothing. The frequency stayed open, and humanity transmitted nothing into it, and the ships in the orbital lane stayed still, and the maintenance staff remained on site in their service agreements, doing the work they were contracted to do, and the nodes stayed dark. You do not answer that kind of silence with a demand. You let the silence be the answer. At hour 91, LT, Harvin made her final log entry for the Castle Null formation. It read all 51 vessels holding position, passive thermal nominal, registration list complete. She underlined complete. In 9 years of log entries, she had underlined nothing. The format had been consistent to the point of being indistinguishable from a machine record. Same spacing, same notation, same columns, never a mark outside the printed lines. 1 underlined. I read this entry 6 months later and sat with it for a while. "We remember you are there" had become something slightly different. Not a reminder, not a signal. A completion, the closing of a record that had been kept open for 9 years waiting for the right word to end on. The right word was complete. Elder Orivin's broadcast came at hour 74, 18 hours before the compact's formal concession. She sent it to the full coalition relay list. It was not addressed to the compact. It was not addressed to humanity. It was addressed to the record, the kind of statement you make not because it changes anything, but because the moment requires that the thing be said clearly by someone for the archive. She said we were watching for a weapon. What they built was not a weapon. It was a record, a relay, a maintenance contract, and 11 years of patience. The lesson was written in very ordinary language. The compact's formal concession came at hour 109. Resolution 44 Primus was dissolved. The coalition was seated. Platform accommodations were set to standard grade for all parties. The Dovan assembly firm was awarded the construction contract for the new platforms. They built them over the following 4 months. When the work was done, the floor of the convocation chamber was level. All sections, all delegations, the same height from the ground. I visited the chamber 8 months after the session. I noted the floor. I noted specifically that it was level. I wrote 1 line in my field log about it and nothing more. Kellen walked back into the convocation chamber 3 weeks after the concession. She set the transit case on the table. Both sides were empty now. The left side, the 9 years of resolution 44 primus, the 9 sets of procedural silence, the 9 years of showing up and being answered with nothing had been filed. The right side, the 2,309 pages, the maintenance records, the carrier wave exchanges, the 14 years of market corridors and shared transit holds had been transmitted, entered into the formal record, and answered. There was nothing left to carry. She left the case on the table when she walked out, not as a statement, not as a gesture. The case was simply no longer needed, and she did not take things she no longer needed, and so she left it there. The chamber was empty. The new floor was level. The case sat on the table with both sides open, and no one came to collect it for 3 days. I made my final entry on this account 14 months after the session. Kellen read 14 names aloud in the forward room of the transit vessel Orvith 7 on the night of the transmission. She was alone. No one else was present. The duty log recorded the duration. It took 22 minutes. There are 14 names. That is how long she gave each one.